Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside Dave Corbin. Glad to have you with us as we explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020 vision.
Well, Dave, a difficult day yesterday. We got the news that our great teacher and mentor, Dr. Angelo Codevilla, had died the night before. We were fortunate to be his first two PhD students and to benefit from his academic, professional, and personal wisdom and advice over many years. And of course, we want to pay tribute to him with this episode today.
Yeah, I thought of many different ways over the last 25 years that I hear the news of his passing. He had fought through two heart transplants. He was on his third heart and continued to just work hard, work too hard. And when I got the news from his son that he was in a car accident and had died, it just didn't seem like the way that he would go. But I think that he had lived, and he would say this himself, he had lived a much longer life than he thought he would have. And he was fighting and writing and thinking and being Angelo Codevilla right to the end. So,
yeah,
but very sad. I think that it's one of the sad things about his life is that he's known by some, but he was so brilliant on so many things, and his wisdom could be so used today. So I think it leaves it up to us and others to try to carry those things that he's written in his books and the things that he shared with us as a teacher to others, but definitely a sad day.
Yeah, you think about all the different ways that you might have come into contact with his readings, whether you're somebody who was in the intelligence community and had read his criticism of that community, sharp criticism from the 70s and 80s especially, but really carrying forward through the war on terrorism, whether you knew him as somebody who just had an encyclopedic knowledge of the international scene going back hundreds of years and all the different groups and dynamics and stories and mores of various peoples, whether you knew him as a teacher of the classics of political philosophy, somebody who had read deeply, especially in figures like a Thucydides or a Machiavelli. If you knew him as the public intellectual who wrote about the ruling class the last decade or so and had quite a audience on those fronts. So just so many different facets of his scholarship and popular writing. And it really all circled around some fundamental themes. And I think some of those are themes we're going to take up today, actually, as we do our discussion of Aristotle. I think it's very much in the spirit of Dr. Codevilla's scholarship and public commentary to think very carefully about regimes, right? The first book that we were involved in him writing as graduate students was The Character of Nations, and did a little bit of research, right? You especially on that front, but my name's in the book. So I got a little bit of credit for my 1 hour of effort, and you got the same credit for your 200 hours. But anyway, that was a book that was a very much Aristotelian kind of book. The Character of Nations, Thucydides kind of book. Let's talk about regimes at a high level. And I think that was maybe the heart of his project, if you want to think about the thing he cared most about, and the American regime in particular, which of course led him into all kinds of reflections on that in the last decade or so.
Yeah, I'd been asked by the editors of Basic Books to write a 20th century Aristotle's Politics, and that's what he set out to do by talking about the character of nations and on how that comes into being and what the interplay is between the regime and society, and how regimes influence societies and societies in turn influence regimes. And that certainly is front and center in Aristotle's politics discussion in book 3, how the two go hand in hand. Yeah, I think that to capture Angelo Codevilla, we couldn't have come up with a better passage from Aristotle, because it deals with citizenship. And I think of the many loves that Dr. Codevilla had, one of his greatest loves was his love of his American citizenship. He had come here from northern Italy as a 14-year-old, and he loved all of the great things that the American regime had to offer for those who were have-nots, like he and his mother. So he was very much spurred on to defend those things that were right and good and honest and true about the American regime, and be willing to advocate the hard decisions when those things and our nation were under fire. So, yeah. So why don't we get into Aristotle's politics? It's a good way to honor him. So, all right. So we're only going to cover part 1 of book 3. Aristotle introduces book 3 by saying that he wants to talk about the essence and attributes of various kinds of government. To do that, you have to answer the primary question: what is a state? 2 answers come into being when you ask what is a state. Some people argue that a state does a certain act. The United States did X. Another group of people say that, well, it's not the state that does that, but it's the ruling class within that state. So it's the Biden administration that does X, Y, and Z. Aristotle's answer, though, is different. Aristotle's answer says that a state is composite, like any whole made up of many parts. These are the citizens who compose it. So to answer the question, what is a state, you have to turn to what it's made up of, and it's made up of citizens. So what does he have to say about citizens and what a citizen is, Matt?
Yeah, well, a citizen has to do with other places. He talks about ruling and being ruled in turn. And so as he works through that, he talks about 2 particular functions that citizens take up. And I think we've got very easy contemporary parallels for that. There's a deliberative function that goes along with citizenship, and there's a judicial function. And so it's to begin to introduce the point, it's not just that you're there in that same geographic space with other people. And it's not that you're somebody who has some connection to the government, but there's some real active involvement in governing and being governed that is involved for Aristotle in the essence of citizenship. And so I think this gives us a lot to talk about as we think about our contemporary scene. And again, as we think about the work of Dr. Codevilla to really invigorate American citizenship in the last decade plus.
Yeah, a citizen is a thinking officer. A citizen is a officer who speaks, who uses words. A citizen is not a spectator. A citizen is one who acts. So to think and to speak and to act, that's what defines true citizenship. So if you were to point out who are American citizens today, we very well might define ourselves as citizens based upon the fact that, oh, we're in the United States, or, oh, I have a certain set of rights. But Aristotle, 2,500 years ago, are saying in order to truly be a citizen, you have to do the work of a citizen. And that requires something of you. And holding office is important. And even democratic government requires an indefinite holding of that office. So if we're living within a democratic republic, there's a great burden and responsibility that is upon us to actually live up to this comprehensive definition of a citizen.
I think it's worth drawing the connection back to where we began at the beginning of book 1, as he talks about why man is a political animal. And why is that? Because we have speech, because we're able to deliberate, because we're able to reflect upon questions of justice. And so if we're political animals, but we don't have the chance to do political things, we're really missing out on some essential part of our humanity. So citizenship is a natural extension of this understanding of human beings as political animals. So where a human being is a citizen of a given regime, that person is able to do that truly human thing of engaging in those conversations about the just and the unjust and try to move one's community in the direction of justice.
Yeah, and isn't it amazing that we live in an age that's called a democratic? We live in a modern age We live in an age with great communication and openness and transparency. So the assumption would be that citizenship in our age would flourish. But the question asked by people like Dr. Codevilla and others like Pierre Manent isn't it remarkable or ironic that in this age of enlightenment and democracy, citizens are not acting more, but they're acting less. They're spectating more and doing less. They're watching others think and not thinking for themselves, or they're having others think for them. So they're not doing, by and large, the work of citizenship, which is required in order to flourish.
Yeah, and where they are doing something that maybe looks like that, it's sending off a Twitter zinger, right, rather than actual deliberation. And so you feel like, well, I'll give you my 2 cents. I'll let you know what I think about that. And rather than really being involved in a process that would be refining a proposal or talking about important questions in a way that might lead to a change in policy, we just sort of let out our frustration. But for the most part, the decision-making level is far above where the typical citizen is acting and engaging.
Yeah, hence the famous quotes that we went over last season of Tocqueville on what democratic despotism might look like, which for some is a pretty good definition of the world today, when he defines a citizenry today as an innumerable crowd of like and equal men who revolve on themselves without repose, procuring the small and vulgar pleasures with which they fill their souls. And above this crowd, an immense tutelary power is elevated. That's a very different presentation of how politics ought to work democratically, according to Aristotle, and how it oftentimes works today. So moving forward to applying this to American government and implications for American government today, how might we take Aristotle's definition of the state and definition of citizenship and point to a needed resurgence in areas of administration?
Yeah, well, let's think about maybe the 2 pieces of that. So he talks about deliberation and he talks about judicial administration. And so what's it mean for us to deliberate on matters today? Well, we recognize that the democracy that Aristotle is talking about is direct democracy, where individual citizens are gathering. Of course, we don't have that. We have representation. And in 2021, we have, at least at the national level, very distant representation. And I would say distant in 2 ways. Distant because it's a large number of people. So even in the House, you're talking about 800,000 approximately people that are being represented by a single representative. And so it's hard to have any individual connection or contact with that person. But also distant because we have the administrative state that's been built up over the last 100 years. And so it's a very difficult question to answer and say, well, if I were to change the people in office, if I were to spearhead a movement to really transform the House, let's say, where we have the most direct and immediate involvement in our government, what would follow from that? How much would things be different? How much would the budget change? How much would the regulatory schemes that affect my business and my life change? How much would the overall sense of the regime be transformed by that change? And I think the answer we'd have to say is not very much. It's a pretty narrow range that defines the differences between one administration and another from the standpoint of the opportunity for reform bottom up. And so what that leads us to is a conclusion, number one, perhaps, that we need to do things to reform the administrative state, to open up room for more deliberation and for a greater connection between congressional action and actual policy on the ground. But also, I think it reminds us of the importance of local action. And I think it's one of the things, I was speaking to a student yesterday, one of the things that's come out of our experience of the last year and a half with COVID, there's been a sense of a reinvigoration of local government, right? We have a sense that it matters. And we think about what it means to be in this state versus that state. And even sometimes at the community level, the city level, we see some differences. And so we're able to see, perhaps in a way we haven't recently, some of the benefits and some of the hazards, perhaps, of local self-government. But it might lead us back into the exercise of some deliberative function, at least, as we re-engage those lower levels of government.
Yeah, and in the years that I've taught, and I'm sure it's been the case with you as well, Matt, when we have students who are interested in politics, oftentimes their first inclination is to get to Washington, D.C. as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
So they can spend a summer there and be around the important people. And then soon enough, they realize that, well, there's not much happening in Washington, D.C. There's more happening in Charlotte, North Carolina, or Boise, Idaho, than what they could do in D.C. But we're drawn, right, to this Leviathan. We're drawn to the lights and the power and all the rest. Whereas true citizenship and even patriotism, if it's going to be renewed, may have to be renewed at that local level where you make commitments to people who you are in communion with in day-to-day activities. I too had a student that I was speaking with yesterday who's about to write her senior thesis in high school on the question of what happened to American patriotism, and is there any way to remedy the loss of American patriotism? And I pointed out what you just said, that renewal, resurgence of patriotism has to come from commitment. It has to come from commitment that perhaps can only be built right now at the local level, perhaps with national leadership that's suggesting that it ought to be built at the local level, but a renewed patriotism that is more Republican in nature than the one that we had in the 20th century that was based upon the expansion of American empire and our interests and our sharing of our way of life abroad.
Yeah, and just to add the second piece of this. So we said deliberation, but then also involvement in judicial decision making. And again, that might seem really distant from our experience. Certainly, we think about Supreme Court cases. We just got announced this week that on December 1st, the Supreme Court will take up this very important case concerning abortion, and so that may lead to the overturning of Roe versus Wade. We'll see what comes from all that, but that seems very, very far removed from the individual citizen, and that's of course one of the challenges of the judiciary having such a role in framing social policy, that it's so far removed from individual citizen interaction. But what Aristotle has in mind primarily is not things we think about the Supreme Court doing, but jury trials and the role that citizens play in enforcing criminal law in particular, but civil law as well, and making those kind of decisions for their peers, for their local neighbors. And it's just something that I think we've just lost any concept of as a means of being engaged in our government, because look, we all want to avoid jury duty, right? You get that postcard in the mail and you think, oh man, is there any way to get out of this? And you look at the dates and whatever the rules are, and everyone kind of tries to figure out the best way to maneuver around it. But remember that one of the key things that was complained about at the time of the Revolution, one of the intolerable acts that led to the first Continental Congress coming into being, was a law that allowed for the removal of British officers and officials from Massachusetts to other colonies or to England for trials when they were being charged with a capital crime. And the Americans saw what this meant, right? That rather than being accountable to the local population when they had killed somebody, perhaps think about the Boston Massacre, for example, and now they're going to have a much more friendly audience, right? They can stack the deck. And so the involvement at the time of the Revolution of American citizens in jury trials was seen as a means of restraining government that had gone too far. And you think about some of the ways that prosecutorial discretion is used today, or plea bargaining, other means that kind of cut the people out of judicial process and therefore undercut our ability to rein in improper uses of that prosecutorial power. Well, we want to spend some time in particular speaking about the legacy of Dr. Codevilla and our own particular memories of our time working with him over the years. And of course, most people know him as a public intellectual. Most of the tributes that we've seen so far are connecting to his recent writings on the ruling class or things of this sort. And of course, those who are regular listeners to our podcast know that he was our interview for the last episode of our second season, which, by the way, is now the most downloaded episode to date. So we're grateful to him and his reputation for drawing an audience to listen to that conversation. But I want to play a clip from that because it's really on point for the conversation we've just had. I think it might be a nice transition to other reflections on our time working with Dr. Codevilla over the last quarter century. This is from our discussion last May, where we were looking at an essay that he'd written called American Exodus, about the challenges of living in an increasingly oligarchic regime.
You don't have to have an awfully good memory to realize that many of the things that we're told today are right, indeed the essence of rightness, were in a few years back considered wrong in the essence of wrongness. For example, the notion that that a man could become a woman could become a man simply by wishing. These are not small things, and perhaps the most compelling thing about all of them is that we, the people, have had no choice in the matter. We are supposed to live under laws made by elected representatives, but none of these things have been forced upon us by law. But there they are. And so that raises the question, what are ordinary people to do about essentially a revolution in their lives, nothing theoretical, but they're practical in how they live, revolution and what they think is good or bad, what they have to do about it, because they cannot do anything apparently about it by exercising the vote.
Yeah, it's really interesting here when you listen back to that clip in May, and this was a big theme for Dr. Codevilla, that in order for us to truly live up to the principles of the American regime, we have to be a deliberative agent by consenting to the laws that are passed, by paying attention to the laws that are passed. But if that lawmaking ability is taken out of our hands, then are we no longer citizens anymore? And hence that this movement, he suggests, moving from democracy to oligarchy, where it's the few who actually have taken power out of our hands, the ruling class who rule, and we just follow what they say. And hence the changes that have occurred over 50 years on things that we wouldn't have wanted, but we'd had no power over those decisions. They put them into place, whether that was through the Supreme Court or through various acts of agencies of the administrative state. But that main lawmaking road toward change has not been the pathway in which change has been imposed upon us.
Now we've seen an increasing effort, not just to nationalize power, but in some ways to internationalize power. Yesterday was the speeches at the UN, and President Biden, among others, spoke there. What did you make of his remarks in this context?
Well, I think what Dr. Codevilla would do is he'd look at the language of President Biden's speech, and he'd see errors over and over and over again in the speech, because the words that are coming out of President Biden's mouth don't relate to reality. So I'll give you a couple examples of that. Our collective future will hinge on our ability to recognize our common humanity and to act together. This is a dreamlike Alice in Wonderland language. Collective futures, collective humanities, common humanities. That's not the way that the world works. The world is made up of different people. Those people associate with one another in different partnerships. Those partnerships don't always have the same end in mind. What is good for us may be something bad for another. Our good is not always something another wants. Hence, you have to have your eyes open to the way that the world works, and you have to have a clear sense as to what your individual mission as a nation state is. But to use a language where you just assume a commonality, you assume a collectivism that isn't there, is to repeat the errors of the 20th century when we had so many statesmen doing just that. And it took the de Gaulles, it took the Churchills, it took the Reagans to see international politics as it actually worked, rather than actually as to how we wanted it to work. And I think that there's one thing that I would love more than anything else for anyone who's listening to this show: go and pick up one of Angelo Codevilla's books and read it. Read the words, read how he describes war, read how he describes international politics, how statesmen act. Actually take a look at the language and read through it and see that it's filled with axioms, it's filled with logic, it's filled with relating in common sense terms to the way that the world works. You may not like that the world works that way. That was one of the great things about Dr. Codevilla. He didn't try to dream up a world that wasn't. He had to work with the world that was, both as an advocate for certain policies, but in his own personal life. Reality was front and center in the Codevillian universe.
Yeah. And so, one of the things we wanted to talk about in our remaining time is Dr. Codevilla as a teacher and a mentor, because as I said at the beginning of the show, we had the privilege of being his first two PhD students. And I think back to the first class that I had with him was a small group of students. We were studying Thucydides and Machiavelli, and it was just a careful read through the texts. His deep and discerning comment. That was a time when he was in the middle of translating Machiavelli's Prince, which he then published with Yale, and a great edition that really captures the earthiness of the language of Machiavelli. And he always would joke that he kind of wrote a little bit like Yogi Berra spoke, and intentionally would say things that were obscure or open to multiple interpretations. And a lot of the translations of the Prince would kind of clean that up, make it better prose in some ways. But Dr. Codevilla was wanting to stay near to the original intent and the ambiguity that was in the Prince originally. And then my second class with him was a seminar on de Gaulle. Of course, de Gaulle was the subject of his dissertation back in his graduate school days. And then my third class with him was an independent study that was connected with my dissertation, so on American political thought. So, you've got somebody at the graduate level who is dealing with such a range of topics with such discernment and such ability to distill the essential point. I always thought that was the feature in his writing and speaking that was most front and center. He could always distill the essential point, and he could be a merciless editor when you gave him something that you were writing, whether it was a graduate student essay or when we wrote a book 10 or so years ago. We passed it by him, and you get it back covered in red, right? As he cuts out all these extra phrases and words, and tries to force you to clarify your thought by clarifying your words.
Yeah, that's a part of the reality, right, of Codevilla's focus on reality, is realizing as a graduate student how much you don't know, or how little you know, and how much you need to become a better thinker, how much you need to become a better writer. And, that's not happening, or it doesn't happen much in the academy today. I read a great essay that we need more coaches than philosophy professors. And what the article was trying to say is that we need coaches sometimes in the classroom who said, really, that sentence makes no sense. Or what are you trying to say here? Or what's your point? But we don't act that way as professors. We're like, well, you did a couple things right here, right? We never get to the point where give me 10 push-ups. And Codevilla very much as a teacher was like, this is bunk. I can't believe it. And sometimes it'd be hard. You have to listen to that. Yeah. But he was right. And we needed to improve, and we needed we needed those 10 push-ups. And I think to the degree that, we've gotten better as thinkers and writers and teachers, his cold water produced a lot of that.
Yeah. And one of the things that was really something at BU was, these classes were small, and he was right there, right? I mean, it was individual connections and attention, and he was totally invested in your education. If there were 3 students in the class, he cared about every one of those students getting it and making the progress they needed to make on the clarity of their understanding, the clarity of their thought. Really a model for that kind of mentor-professor relationship.
Yeah, and I mentioned this before, but I mean, the first time I ever met him, no one wanted a TA for him. And I went in there, and he was really interested in my interest in Machiavelli and Shakespeare. and wanted to work with me, but he turned the conversation to something more important than Machiavelli and Shakespeare. He turned the conversation to where I was spiritually, where I was in my faith walk. Did I attend church? And I told him I'm not attending church. And he just got right to the point. This is perfect Codevilla. Okay, so do you believe in God? Yes. Do you believe he's all powerful, all good, all knowing? Yeah, of course. Yes, 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 yes. Okay, Corbin, you believe all these things, but you can't find an hour a week to worship him. And that's a perfect kind of example
Yep.
of Codevilla's mind at work and his speech at work too, where he could have held back and been reticent and said, oh, okay. But he got right to the point, because for him to know God was important. To him, to love God was important. And if he had a person in front of him who he was just meeting, who said that he knows God and believes in him, but couldn't find an hour to worship him, he was going to point you in that direction. So that was just the way he was in everything. And I know it was hard. I mean, you and I kind of felt the brunt of this oftentimes, but hard truth is something that's in short supply in the 21st century. And he definitely, he spoke the language of hard truth, not because he wanted to put you down, but because he wanted to build you up.
Yeah, it was hard truth, but it wasn't harsh truth. And it was always with a smile. He had a great grin and just a great laugh, little chuckle, right? When something amused him, you see his eyes light up. And so, you knew that he was with you. And, in subsequent years, obviously, after we finished our graduate work, he was always ready to help with a recommendation or make a connection, introduce you to somebody, to kind of build that relationship. He wanted you to succeed. He had a certain vision probably for the terms on which he would like to see us succeed, and he would help us in that direction. But he was always very supportive and interested as much in family life and, those kind of relationships as he was in anything that was happening professionally for us.
Yeah, very much so. That, and at the end of the day, I think, and this, I mean, if you wanted to sum his worldview up in a sentence or two, God gives us a certain amount of time in this world, and we ought to enjoy that time. That takes hard work. That takes confronting reality as it is, and that takes sometimes defending the peace that you're after. But at the end of it all, it's all about enjoying a lasting peace that can only come in a belief in God and in his eternal peace. So that's where he is right now. And I just think, he's at peace. And for a person, for a teacher, for a public intellectual who wrote so much about war, about conflict, about tension, to know that in his heart, what was most essential was to find that resting peace, is to really know Angelo Codevilla.
Well, thank you, as always, for joining us for this episode. And, we hope you've been able to get a little bit of a sense of the great man and teacher and mentor that Dr. Codevilla was. And we know his legacy will continue in his students and those who have read his work. We look forward to being back with you with a new episode next week.